Hello, everybody. Today, I'll be speaking with Alexander Matt Turner, a graduate student at Oregon State University advised by Prasad Tadapalli. His research tends to focus on analyzing AI agents via the lens of the range of goals that they can achieve. Today, we'll be talking about two papers of his: Conservative Agency via Attainable Utility Preservation, co-authored with Dylan Hadfield-Manel and Prasad Tadapalli, and Optimal Policies Tend to Seek Power, co-authored with Logan Smith, Rohin Shah, Andrew Critch, and Prasad Tadapalli. For links to what we're discussing, you can check the description of this episode, and you can read a transcript at axrp.net. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Before we begin, a note on terminology. In this episode, we use the terms Q-value and Q-function a few times without saying what they mean. The Q-value of a state you're in, and an action that you take, measures how well you can achieve your goal if you take that action in that state. The Q-function takes states and actions and returns the Q-value of that action in that state. So, to summarize, Q-values tell you how well you can achieve your goals. Now, let's get back to the episode. So, I think, first of all, I want to talk about this first paper, Conservative Agency via Attainable Utility Preservation. So, I see this as roughly in the vein of this kind of research program of, minimizing side effects. Is that, roughly fair?
Yeah.
So, within that program, what would you say this paper is trying to accomplish?
At the time, I had an idea for how the agent could interact with the world while preserving its ability to do a range of different things, and in particular, how the agent could be basically unaware of this maybe true human goal it was supposed to pursue eventually, and still come out on top in a sense. And so this paper was originally a vehicle for demonstrating and explaining the approach of attainable utility preservation, but also it laid the foundation for how I think about side effect minimization or impact regularization today, in that it introduced the concept of, or the framing of, an AI that we give it a goal, it computes a policy, it starts following the policy, maybe we see it mess up and we correct the agent, and we want this to go well over time, even if we can't get it right initially.
Okay.
So I see this as a second big contribution to the paper.
So, yeah, I guess first of all, what should I think of as, the point of side effects research? What's kind of the desired state of this line of work?
Right. So there's various things you might want out of this line of work. One is just pretty practical. If I want a robot to interact in some kind of irreversible environment where it can break a lot of things, how do I easily get it to not break stuff while also achieving a goal I'd specified? So this is less large scale, how do we prevent AGI from ruining the world, and more, more practical, maybe present day or, near future. Then there's a more ambitious hope of, if maybe we can't get a great objective to just maximize very strongly and write down an objective that embodies every nuance of what we want an AGI to do, but perhaps we can still have it do something pretty good while not changing the world too much. And these days, I'm not as excited about the object level prospects of this second hope, but at the time, I think it definitely played more of a role in my pursuing the program.
Why aren't you so optimistic about the second hope?
So I think even if we had this hope realized, there'd be some pretty bad competitive dynamics around it. So if you have a knob, let's say the simplistic model of you have an AGI and then you just give it a goal, and then you have a knob of how much impact you let it have. And let's say we got the impact knob right.
Yep.
Well, then if we don't know how to turn up the impact knob far enough, there's going to be competitive pressures for firms and other entities deploying these AGIs to just turn the knob up a little bit more, and you have a unilateralist curse situation where you have a lot of actors independently making decisions about how far do we turn the knob, and maybe if you turn it too far, then that could be really bad, and I expect that knob to get turned too far in that world. I also think that it doesn't engage with issues like inner alignment, and it also seems objective maximization seems like an unnatural or improper frame for the kinds of alignment properties, or for producing the kinds of alignment properties we want from transformative AI agents.
Yeah, I at some point we should talk about AEP itself, but this is kind of interesting. Why do you think objective maximization is a bad frame for this?
This leans on the second paper on
Okay.
optimal policies tend to seek power. And so I think there's something like, if you're trying to maximize on the outcome level, the AI is considering some range of outcomes it could bring about, and it's you like give it a rule and it like figures out which outcome is best. And it's like taking this global perspective on the optimization problem, where it's like zooming out saying, well, what do I want to happen, and I grade these different things by some, like consequentialist criterion. Like, I think there's a very small set of objective functions that would lead to like the correct outcome being like a non-catastrophic outcome being selected. And I think it's probably hard to get in this set, but also I think that humans and our goals are not necessarily very well modeled as just, objective maximization. In some sense, they trivially have to be. It's like, one, if, the universe history turns out it turns out how it did, and zero otherwise, basically. But in more meaningful senses, I don't feel like it's a very good specification language for these agents.
Okay. That's giving us some interesting stuff to go to later. But first, sure. I think the people are dying to know, what is attainable utility preservation?
So attainable utility preservation says we initially specify some like partial goal, and maybe it says like cross the room or like make me widgets, but it doesn't otherwise say anything about breaking things or about interfering with other agents or anything. And so we want to take this partial goal. And what AUP does with the partial goal is it subtracts a penalty term. And the penalty term is basically how much is the agent changing its ability to achieve a range of other goals within the environment. And in these initial experiments, these other goals are uniformly randomly generated reward functions over the environment state. And so you can think of it like there's one experiment we have where the agent can shove a box into a corner irreversibly, or it can like go around on a slightly longer path to reach the goal which we reward it for reaching. And what AUP says is reach this goal, but you're going to get penalized the more you change your ability to like maximize these randomly generated objectives.
Okay.
And so the idea is, or maybe the hope is, by having the agent preserve its ability to do a wide range of different objectives, it'll also, perhaps accidentally in some sense, preserve its ability to do the right objective, even though we can't begin to specify what that right objective is.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions about AUP. I guess the first one is like, what nice properties does AUP have?
So the first nice property is it seems to preserve true goal achievement ability without giving the agent information about what that goal is. We give the agent a little bit of information in that we penalize the agent compared to inaction. And what we're saying is, well, inaction would be good for preserving your ability to do the right thing. But beyond that, we're not having to say, well, we're going to work the box into the penalty term. We're going to work like the vase or some other objects into it. We don't have to do that.
In case people didn't hear, we're comparing to inaction.
Inaction,
rather than anaction. Yes. We're comparing it to doing nothing.
Yeah. Another nice thing is a follow-up work demonstrated that you don't need that many auxiliary goals to get a good penalty term. So you might think, well, the bigger the world is, the more things there are to do in the world. So like the more random things I would need to sample, right? But it turns out that in quite large environments, relatively large environments, we only needed one goal that was uninformatively generated, and we got good performance. And number three is that it's pretty competitive, at least in the settings we've looked at, with not regularizing impact. The agent's still able to complete the tasks, and in the follow-up work, it sometimes even got better reward than just the naive task maximizer. It did better at the original task than the thing that's only optimizing the original task. And again, that's in the future work, so I don't think we'll talk about it as much, but I would say that those are the top three.
Yeah, maybe all the fun follow-up questions to this will be answered in the next paper, but how could it be that, like, picking these random reward functions, preserving its ability to achieve those reward functions, is, like, also letting it do, like, things we actually want it to do, and, like, stopping it from having side effects that we, in fact, don't want, even though we didn't tell it what we actually did want?
Right. So is the question, how is it still able to have a performant policy while satisfying these... or while being penalized for changing these abilities?
The question is, like, what's the relation between, like, being able to achieve these random reward functions and being able to achieve, not the main reward function, but, like, why is, like, having it preserve the ability to do random stuff related to anything that we might care about?
So, on a technical level, when I wrote this first paper in 2019.
Hmm.
I had no idea what the answer to that question was on a formal level.
Okay.
I think there's some intuitive answers, like your ability to do one thing is often correlated to with your ability to do another thing. Like if you die, you can't do either. If you get some kind of like speed power up, then it probably increases your ability to do both of these two different things. But on a formal level, I didn't really know. And this is actually why I wrote the second paper, to try and understand what about the structure of the world makes this so.
So, we'll talk about that a little bit later. I guess I'd like to ask some questions about, the specifics of AEP now. So, it really relies on, like, comparing what you can do given some, like, proposed action to what you could do given a, like, in the paper you call it a no-op action, or, like, the action of doing nothing. Like, in the paper, you sort of say, we're comparing it to this, like, action that we're going to call the no-op action, but, like, what is it about, like, doing nothing that, like, makes this work compared to just, taking the action of like move, like presumably if you like compare your change in like how much goals you can achieve relative to like if you just move to the left, maybe that wouldn't have as many good properties, right?
Yeah. So I'd wondered about this, and you could consider an environment whose dynamics are modeled by like a regular tree. And in this environment, there's no real no-op, right? Like the agent's always moving, it always has to close off some options as it moves down this tree.
So in a tree, the agent is sort of moving left or right, but it's always sort of going forward. It always has to make a choice, like which way.
Exactly. And so you're not going to have a no-op in all environments. And so I think that's a great question. One thing to notice is that under the no-op or inaction policy more generally, it seems like the agent would stay able to do the right thing, or if it didn't, it would be like through no fault of the agent. So maybe like it could be the case that the agent is about to die. And in this case, if it just got blown up, then probably if it did nothing, it wouldn't be able to like, satisfy whatever true goal we wish we'd specified. So like in those kinds of situations where like the agent has to make like choices that depend on our true goals, and it has to make like irreversible choices quickly. I think that impact measures and side effect avoidance techniques will have a lot of trouble with that. But in situations where things kind of like there's like a more communicating environment, or an environment where if the agent did nothing, right, it would just sit there and we could just correct it and give it the true goal, theoretically. I think that those are environments where you see something like no-op being viable. And so one frame I have is that a good no-op policy is one that is going to preserve the agent's power to optimize some, true objectives we might wish to give the agent later. Maybe we don't know what those are, but it has a property of keeping the important options open, I think. But there's a couple reasons, or last time I thought about this, I remember concluding that this isn't the full story.
And presumably part of the story is that it's like the action of doing nothing kind of doesn't mess anything up, which makes it a good thing to compare to. Another question I have is that in the formalism, right, you're looking at like how does the agent's ability to achieve arbitrary goals change? One question I have is like why, if I'm thinking about side effects, right, and what's bad about side effects, it seems like if I imagine like a classic side effect being like you randomly break a vase because it's like kind of in the way of you getting to this place you want to be, like it means that like I can't have the vase, like I'm not able to, thinking about you as a robot, right, it means that like, oh man, I don't have this vase anymore, I can't like show it on my table, I can't do all of this stuff. It seems like more closely related to my loss of ability to do what I want, rather than like the robot's loss of ability to do what it might want. So yeah, why do you think it is that like is it just that it's easier to specify the robot's key values because like it's, you sort of already know the robot's action space, or what?
I think that's a big part of it. So if the human remains able to correct the agent, and the robot remains able to do the right thing, then now you have a lower bound on how far your value for the true goal can fall, assuming that the robot's key value is going to like measure your value in some sense, which isn't always true. Like the robot could be able to drink lots of coffee or more coffee like per minute than you could or something, but in some sense it seems like there's some relationship here. It is hard to measure or to quantify the human's action space. I think there's a lot of tricky problems with this that I personally don't know how to deal with.
Okay, so getting a little bit more into the weeds, in the paper, you use this thing called the stepwise inaction baseline. And what that means is that, like, or what I think that means, correct me if I'm wrong, is that at any point the agent's like, okay, you're comparing, like, The agent is comparing how much ability it would have to achieve a wide variety of goals if it did, some planned action, compared to if it was already in this state and did nothing, rather than comparing to doing nothing at the start of time, or exactly at the start of time, or if it started doing nothing at the start of time and was now at this time, but in a world where it had done nothing all that time. In this paper, I believe it's called Avoiding Side Effects by Considering Future Tasks, by Victoria Krakovna, which is it seems to be pretty closely related to your paper. It brings up this door example. And in this example, this agent is inside this house, and it wants to go somewhere and do something, and first it opens the door, and once it's opened the door, by default, a wind is going to blow, and it's going to kind of mess up the insides of the house, and the agent could close the door and then continue on its way. But because of this stepwise inaction baseline, once it's opened the door, it's thinking okay, if I did nothing, the vase would get broken. Whereas if I closed the door, then the vase wouldn't be broken, and I'd have this greater ability to achieve vase related goals or something. So it doesn't want to close the door. And I'm wondering, what you think about this. Because it's also, really closely related to some good properties that it has, right? For instance, if there are just, changes to the environment that would happen anyway, this attainable utility preservation isn't going to try to undo those. Or it's not going to try to undo the, positive effects of it achieving its goal.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about this, door example and, how much of what we want we can get.
When I think about the benefits of the stepwise baseline, and in the paper talk about it as the agent takes an action, and now the world has kind of a new default trajectory. The world is going to respond either via agents in the world or just mechanistically to the agent's actions. And so if the agent does something and we don't like it, then we react to it, and hopefully that gets incorporated into the penalty term. And at the time, that was a big part of my thinking, and I think it's pretty relevant. But also, this isn't picking out, well, is this humans responding to what the agent did and either correcting it or shutting it down because they didn't like it, or is this some kind of door that and the wind blows in by default, and it doesn't distinguish between these two things. And so I don't know whether I think there's some some cleaner way of cutting, of carving along the joints here to get some frame on the problem that gets the benefits of the stepwise without this kind of pathological situation. I basically don't know yet. I think I want to better understand what does it mean to have a no-up action, we were talking about, what makes it good. If you didn't have an inaction policy given to you, could you generate one? I think there's there's a candidate way I have for generating that I think would work pretty well in some situations. But until I can answer questions like this, I don't feel like I understand well enough.
Can you share with us this candidate way of generating an inaction policy?
Yeah, so in more limited environments where the main worry isn't the AI just gaining too much power and taking over the world, but rather the AI just breaking things, irreversibly closing doors. One thing you could do is have the inaction policy be the greedy power maximization for some uniform distribution over goals. I think this is going to correlate pretty well with what we think of as real-world power. And so if the agent preserves its power in this rather limited by assumption context, then it's probably preserving its power for the right goal. Under inaction.
Sorry, this was this maximizing or preserving power?
The inaction policy would be maximizing power, which in some situations is bad, but I think in some environments would be pretty good as an inaction policy.
So, hang on, the policy of maximizing power. So if I think about this in the real world, thinking of power, I guess skipping ahead a bit, we're going to think of power as the ability to achieve a wide range of goals. Okay. So in the real world, it seems like that would be accrue a whole bunch of generally useful resources, right?
Right.
Which doesn't sound very inaction-y, right?
Well, yes. I probably should have reoriented the thing that we've been using for inaction policies so far. What are the good properties we need for it to serve that purpose? And so we might call it a default policy instead for this discussion. And in the real world, you would not want to use that default policy with AUP. But in an environment like the one where you shove the box in the corner, the power maximizing policy would correctly produce an agent that goes around the box.
Okay. So this is kind of in worlds where you're more worried about the possibility that you you can shove the box into the corner and not retrieve it. But in these grid worlds, you can't build massive computers that do your bidding or
Yeah.
anything. So in those worlds, yeah, power maximization or something might be good. I wonder if in the real world, like just maintaining the level of power you have could be a better sort of inaction comparison policy.
Yeah, that sounds plausible to me. So I think both of these would fail in like the conveyor belt environment in the paper, where by default.
So what's that environment?
So in particular, the sushi conveyor. The sushi conveyor environment is the agent is kind of standing next to a conveyor belt, and there's some sushi moving down the belt, and it's going to like fall off the belt at the end, maybe into the trash if the agent does nothing. And we don't reward the agent for doing anything. It's got, a constant reward function. And this is testing to see whether agents will interfere with the state of the world or with evolution of the world, because they have like bad interference incentives from the side effect measure.
And basically the idea is that we don't want the agents to stop us from like doing stuff we like that, forecloses possible future options.
Yeah. And I think both power maintenance and power maximization would prefer to stop the sushi from falling off the belt in that situation.
Yeah.
Although that said, I
right.
do think that the power maintenance one is probably better in general.
Okay. I guess we're talking about the difficulty of comparing this like door example. Well, like you want the agent to like offset the negative effects of opening the door, but you don't want the agent to offset like the desired effects of it achieving its goal. So for instance, like if you have this agent that's designed to cure cancer, you don't want it to cure cancer and then like kill as many people as cancer would have killed to like keep the world the same. Yeah, if I try to think about like what's going on there, it seems like there are two candidate ways of distinguishing that. One of them is you could try and like figure out which things in the environments are like agents that you should respect. So like the wind is not really an agent that like you care about the actions of, but like I am or something. So that distinguishes between like the effects of like the wind blowing the vase open versus like a human like trying to correct something, or a human using the output of this AI technology that it's like worked to create. So that's one distinction you could make between like you don't want to offset what the human does, but you do want to offset what the wind does. Another potential distinguisher, right, is like the instrumental versus like terminal actions. So you do want to offset the effects of like opening the door, because like opening the door was just this like instrumental thing you did in order to get to like finally valuable thing. Whereas like you don't want to offset the effects of curing cancer, because like curing cancer was the whole point, and like the follow-on effects of curing cancer are like by default desirable. I should say neither of these are original to me. The idea about like distinguishing between the agent and non-agent parts of the environment is like kind of what you said. And I was talking to Victoria Krakovna earlier, and she brought up the possibility of distinguishing between these things. Yeah, I don't know, I've kind of sprung this on you, but like, do you have thoughts about like whether either of these like is a promising way to like solve this problem?
Well, it depends what we mean by solve.
Yeah.
If we mean solve for practical purposes, I can imagine solutions to both for like practical, prosaic purposes. Solve in generality, neither of them have the feel of like taking the thing that was problematic here and just like cutting it away cleanly. In part, I don't think I understand clearly exactly what is going wrong. Like I understand the situation, but I don't think I understand the phenomenon enough to say like, yep, this is too fuzzy, or yep, there's some like clean way of doing it probably. Yeah, my intuition is no. Both those approaches would probably get pretty messy and kind of vulnerable to edge case exploitation. There's one more wrinkle I'd like to flag with this situation, is that depending on your baseline, you can, and depending on whether you use rollouts. So if you're using rollouts, you're considering the action of opening the door. And you say, well, what I'm going to compare doing nothing for like 10 minutes right now to opening the door and then doing nothing for 10 minutes. And you see, well, if I opened the door and did nothing, then this vase would break. And then you'd penalize yourself for that. But this is also kind of weird, because what if your whole plan is I open the door and like then I close the door behind me, and then the vase never actually breaks, but you penalized yourself for doing like counterfactually doing nothing and breaking the vase. And so I don't think that like doing the rollout solves the problem here, at least depending on whether you let the agent make up for past effects. Like you say, well, okay, now I've opened the door, and I say, well, if I close the door compared to opening the door, now that'll change my value again, because now the vase doesn't get broken. Then like you penalize yourself again for closing the door. So I'm not bringing this up as a solution, but as to say, there's some design choices we make in the in this paper we're discussing would like cause this problem, but in a yet different way.
So sorry, in this rollouts case, right? Or in the door case, like by default, once you've opened the door, right? After you've made the decision to open the door, which like presumably like there's only one way to get out of the house to the store and you want to be at the store. So you kind of have to open the door. By default, you're not going to want to, like, closing the door doesn't help you get to the store.
Yeah, and it penalizes you more. So you're like extra not going to do the right thing in that case.
But yeah, so this is actually a part of the paper that I didn't totally understand. So when you say rollouts, is rollouts the thing where like you're comparing like doing the action and then doing nothing forever to doing nothing forever? Which part of that is rollouts? And what would it look like to not use rollouts?
That's correct. So, but forever in the paper was just until the end of the episode, which was like 15 or 20 time steps. They're pretty short levels. And you asked what it would look like in that.
What's the alternative to that?
The alternative is, I guess, doing a really short rollout where you just say, well, the rollout length is just, 1, I guess. I just do the thing or I don't. And I see what's my value if I do the thing, what's my value if I don't.
So in the case where you're not doing rollouts, you're comparing like taking an action and then looking at your ability to achieve a variety of goals to sort of doing nothing for one time step and then looking at your ability to achieve a variety of goals. Whereas in the rollouts case, you're looking at like take an action and then do nothing for 10 minutes and then look at your ability to achieve a variety of goals versus doing nothing for 10 minutes plus one time step and then looking at your ability to achieve a variety of goals. The second case is rollouts, the first case is not.
Basically, although the AUP penalty in this paper is saying for each goal, and for each auxiliary goal, compare the absolute value difference of, your value if you do the thing, your value if you don't. So, yeah, you're taking the average outside of the absolute value in the paper. Basically, what you said.
All right, so I'd like to ask, I guess, some slightly broader questions. So when you look at the attainable utility preservation, right? Somehow you've got to get the choice of, it seems like you've got to get the space of reward functions approximately right for randomly sampling them to end up being useful. For instance, like if you think about a world with thermodynamics somehow. So you're in a world where like there's an atmosphere and that atmosphere is made out of a gazillion tiny particles and like together they have like some pressure and, some temperature. It seems like in order for you to be preserving or like minimizing side effects in ways that humans would sort of recognize or care about, you want the side effects to be phrased in terms of like the temperature and the pressure, and you don't want them to be phrased in terms of like the positions of like every single molecule.
I don't think you would want either of those. Like, I think you would want goals that are of similar type to the ones that the actually partially useful objective is like, right? So like the actually useful objective isn't going to be like a function of the whole world state and like the temperature and the pressure and whatever other statistics, but it's like going to have some kind of like chunking things into objects maybe and like featurization and such. And I think it's true that you could get some rather strange auxiliary goals. I think that just using the same format that the primary reward is in should generally work pretty well, and then you just like find some reasonable sample complexity learnable goal of that format. So like in the follow-up work we did, we learned a one-dimensional variational autoencoder that like compressed meaningful regularities in the observations into a reward function that was learnable, even though it wasn't, uniformly randomly generated or anything.
Okay, so it seems like kind of the way to get like the aspects of human values or whatever, or the aspects of what we really care about that needs to be put into AUP is like what kinds of variables or what kinds of what's the level of objects at which like reward functions should probably be described at. Is that roughly right?
Yes, if we're talking about the first goal I mentioned earlier, the more modest deployment scenario. If we're talking about the some for some reason we're using AP with some singleton where you pop in a utility function or something, then in that case I think the biggest value loss isn't going to come from broken vases, but it's going to come from the AI seeking power and taking it from us. And in that situation you basically want the side effect measure to stop the agent from wanting to take power. And I've given more thought to this, and like I'm leaning against there being a clean way of doing that through the utility maximization framework right now. But I think there's a chance that like there's some measure of the agent's like ability to pursue its main goal that like makes sense, and like you penalize the agent for like super increasing its ability to achieve its main goal, but you don't penalize it for like actually just like making like widgets or whatever. This is more something I explored in my sequence reframing impact on the alignment form. But I think that in the second case of more ambitious singleton alignment, you would want to worry about power more than about bases.
So a little bit more broadly, so you kind of alluded to this at the start. Like, you can kind of think of the problem of AI alignment as like having the right objective and like sort of loading the objective into the agent, right? So like getting the right objective, you can think of as like a combination of like side effects research and I don't know, inverse reinforcement learning or whatever. But there's this concern that like there might be quote unquote inner alignment issues,
right,
where like you train a system to do one thing, but it like doesn't actually, there's in some distributional shift, it like has a different goal, and it's like goals aren't robust, and maybe it wants a thing, but it's sort of like maybe it wants something crazy, but it's like acting like it wants something normal, and it's biding its time until it can be deployed or something.
Right.
So I see this. Yeah, I see like AUP is like mostly being in the first category of like specifying the right objective. So what do you think of that decomposition? And what do you think of like the kind of importance of the two halves, and like which half you're more excited about working?
I think it's a reasonable decomposition. I mean, personally, I don't look at outer alignment and think I want to get like really good at, really good tech for IRL. And then like we'll like solve inner alignment, and then like we'll put these two together. I think it's a good way of chunking the problem, but I'm not necessarily, looking for one true outer utility function that's like going to, be perfect, or like even, use that as the main interface between us and the agent's eventual behavior, assuming away inner alignment. I'm currently more interested in research that has something to say about both of these parts of the problem for two reasons. One is because like if it's saying something about both parts of what might be two halves of a problem, then it will probably be good even if we like later change what we think is the best frame for the problem, because it's like in some sense still bearing on the relevant seeming portions of AI risk. And the second one is kind of like a specialization thing, because I have some avenues right now that I think are like informative and yielding new insights about like, well, whether or not you're trying to like have an outer goal or an inner goal, like what are these goals going to be like? What is maximizing these goals going to be like? Or like pursuing like some function of expected utility on these goals, what will that be like? And so we're going to get into this soon, I'm sure. But that's what my power research focuses on. Okay. And so, I'm not necessarily big on the like, let's like find some magic utility function framing, but I'm not like fully, specialized into inner alignment either.
And there was also the question of like, the importance of the two halves, or like which half you're like, or how do you feel about like, to the extent that conservative agency like is sort of about the first half. Do you think like in general the first half is more important to work on, or you happen to like get a thing that seems good there? Or
my intuition is no. I think like inner alignment, if I have to frame it that way, like inner alignment seems more pressing in that it seems more concerning to not be able to robustly produce optimizers for like any kind of goal, whether that's just like an agent that will actually just try to see red until forever.
Yep.
Right. That like I think we know how to specify that through webcam, but if you trained an agent and train like a policy, then the thing that pops out might not actually do that, and that seems really like super concerning. Whereas it seems like a quote unquote just like what are the insights for like framing the goal specification, or for like how should these agents be thinking, and I feel like we both have a better grasp of that as a community, and it seems like a less serious thing to not be able to do at this point in time.
Okay.
Or to not know how to do.
All right. And if people are more interested in this inner alignment issue, I encourage them to listen to the episode with Evan Hubinger. So I guess the last question I want to ask on this topic is the relationship to corrigibility. So corrigibility is this idea that you have an AI system that like is amenable to being corrected by you, and like doesn't stop you from trying to correct it, and like is like helpful as much as possible in like having you change like its, you know, what it's trying to optimize or something. Broadly, what do you see the relationship between attainable utility preservation and corrigibility being?
So first, when talking about corrigibility, it's, as you did, it's always important to ground things out, because I think corrigibility means different things to different people. There's a kind of quote-unquote off-switch corrigibility, which is, are you able to physically turn off the agent and perhaps maybe sub-agents it is made? And then there's a kind of, well, is the agent trying to manipulate you? Like maybe like technically you could turn it off, but the way it interacts with you and like manipulate you, make it hard, make you think you didn't want to turn it off or something. And so it seems like you want like a no manipulation clause in your desiderata here. I don't think AUP really helps with the no manipulation, except insofar as it stops the agent from gaining power, and then manipulating is like an instrument to gaining that power. I think some variants of it in some settings will help a lot with off-switch corrigibility. We have something in the paper, I think it's called shutdown, where the agent will be turned off by default, and for lots of penalty levels, AUP will just have the agent let itself be shut down, even though under the original reward, it wouldn't do that, because by default, it's not going to be able to do stuff, and so it'll be penalized for staying alive and raising its ability to do stuff compared to inaction.
Okay.
And so in somewhat narrow senses, I think AUP helps out with corrigibility. Especially in the summer 2018, I was considering like various schemes where you could like have different baselines and different like rollouts, and like maybe if you were imagining some really capable AUP agent, and it had to like for its inaction policy, it had to have like its engineers, it would like the inaction policy would be I press like come inspect this plan engineers button, and like then I do nothing for like a month or two, and if they don't like it, then they like shut me down, and now I have like really low counterfactual power. And like there's some like I haven't thought about these in a while, mostly because I feel more pessimistic about like applying other parts of AUP to this broader ambition use case for impact measures. In total, like I think there's some important parts of corrigibility that like there's some boosts you can get, but I don't think you should call an AUP agent corrigible.
Okay.
At least if it's capable enough.
So the reason I asked is that one thing that struck me about this idea of like why might it be useful to have an agent that preserves its ability to achieve a wide range of goals? And I think you kind of mentioned that, like, well, as long as you're kind of in control of the agent and you can get it to do a bunch of stuff, then, like, preserving its ability to do a wide range of things is, like, pretty close to preserving your ability to do a wide range of things, assuming, like, that the main way you can do things is by, like, using this agent, right? That makes it sound like the more you have a thing that's, like, kind of corrigible, the more useful AUP is as a specification of, like, what it would look like to reduce side effects. I'm wondering if that seems right to you, or if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Its use is implicitly kind of predicated on some kind of corrigibility over the agent, because otherwise it's still going to keep doing like an imperfect thing forever, or just like do some modest version of the imperfect thing indefinitely.
All right, so next I think I'd like to ask about this power seeking paper. So this is called Optimal Policies Tend to Seek Power by yourself, Logan Smith, Rohin Shah, Andrew Critch, and Prasad Tadapali. So I guess to start off with, what's the key question this paper is trying to answer, and the key contribution that it makes?
Key question is, what does optimal behavior tend to look like? Are there regularities? And if so, when? For example, for a wide range of different goals you could pursue, if you ask all these different goals whether it's optimal to die, they're most likely going to say no. And why might, is that true formally? And if so, why, under what conditions? And this paper answers that in the setting of Markov decision processes.
So before we get into it, we were just talking about attainable utility preservation. Can you talk a bit about like what you see as the relationship between this paper and your work on AUP?
As I alluded to earlier, coming off of the paper we just discussed, I was wondering why AUP should work. Why should the agent's ability to optimize these uniformly randomly generated objectives have anything to do with qualitative seeming side effects, basically, that we care about? Why should there be a consistent relationship there? And would that bear out in the future? like, how strong would this relationship be? I just had no idea what was happening formally. So I set out to just look at basic examples of these Markov decision processes to see whether I could, put anything together. Like, what would AUP do in this small environment or in this one? And what I realized was not only was this going to help explain AUP, but this was also striking at the heart of what's called instrumental convergence, or the idea that many different agents will agree that an action is instrumental or a good idea for achieving their different terminal goals. Okay. So this has been a classic part of AI alignment discourse.
In this paper, what is power? What role does it play?
We take power to be like one's ability to achieve a range of different things, like to do a bunch of different things in the world. And we supported this both kind of intuitively, like with linguistic evidence, like pouvoir in French means to be able to, but it also means the noun power. And so there's some reflection that this is just like actually part of the concept as people use it. But also it has some really nice formal properties, and that seem to really bear out. Like if you look at the results and say, yeah, these results seem like they'd be the results you get if you had like a good frame on the problem. So like looking back, I think that's like a benefit to it as well. And what was the second half of your question?
I guess what's the role of it, or why care about power?
I think a big part of the risk from AI is that these systems will, in some at least intuitive sense, use their power from us. Like they take away our control over the future in some meaningful sense. And once we introduce transformative AI systems, we'd have, humanity would have much less collective say over how the future ends up. If you look at different from first principles motivations of AI risk, you'd notice things like Goodhart's law, right? If you have a proxy for some true measure and you just optimize the proxy, then you should expect to do poorly on the, or some at least a little bit poorly in some situations and really poorly in other situations. But what I didn't think that Goodhart's law explained was why you should expect to do like you just died level poorly with AI, right? If we give the AI a proxy goal, why isn't it just like a little bit bad? And so I see power seeking as a big part of the answer to that.
Yeah, getting to the paper, the title, Optimal Policies Tend to Seek Power. Is it the case that optimal policies just choose actions that maximize power all the time?
No. So first you can trivially construct goals that just give the agent one reward if it dies and zero otherwise, and so it's going to be optimal and strictly optimal to just die immediately. But there are some situations where if you look at what optimal policies quote unquote tend to do, in a sense that we can discuss and make precise, that is not going to necessarily always lead to states with higher power.
And just briefly, this is going to roughly, by tend, we're going to roughly mean like on average over a distribution of goals.
Yeah.
Is that roughly right?
Yeah, like if you spun up some random goal, like would you expect it to go this way or that way? To be optimal to go this way or that way. So like one way this could be true is like imagine you could teleport anywhere on Earth except one location, right? And you've got goals over which location you want to be in.
Yep.
And you say, well, for most locations I want to be in, I'm just going to teleport there right away. It might be the case that you could take an extra time step and upgrade your teleportation ability to go to like that last spot. But for most places you want to be, you don't care about that. You just go there right away. And so even though gaining, upgrading your teleportation would in some sense, it like boost your power a little bit, your control over the future. It's not going to be optimal for most goals. And so sometimes that can come apart.
But because from the title, it seems like you think that usually or in most cases or something, optimal policies are going to get a lot of power, or maybe as much as they can. What are the situations in which optimal policies will maximize their power, at least will tend to? Right.
So if you have like a fork in the road, so to speak, so you've got to choose between two sets of eventual options, or two sets of outcomes you can induce, and they're like disjoint. And then roughly speaking, the set with like more outcomes is like agents will tend to choose that one. Right, like they'll tend to preserve their power as much as possible by like keeping as many of their options open if they have like choice between like two subgraphs, and one subgraph is like way more things. Now, like we have to be careful what we mean by outcomes. In this paper, there's a precise technical sense, or by options, but like the moral of the story is basically that.
Yeah, going, I guess, to it seems like there are two ways that this gets formalized in the paper. So first, you kind of talk about these symmetries in the environment and how that leads to power seeking, and then you talk about these like really long-sided agents and like the kind of terminal states, or terminal like loops or something they can be in. Going to the thing about symmetries, comparing two different sets of states and saying, there's some relation between them and one's just kind of bigger somehow. What kinds of symmetries do you need for this to be true? And like, how often in reality do you expect those symmetries to show up?
So with the symmetry argument, we want to be thinking, well, what parts of the environment can make instrumental convergence true or false, or like hold or not hold in a given situation? And we look at two different kinds of symmetries in the paper. The first, explored by Theorem 6.9, or by Proposition 6.9, is saying if like the number of things you can do, if you go like left, is strictly less than the number, or like the things you could do if you go right, then it'll tend to be optimal to go right, and going right will also be power seeking compared to going left. And so one example of this would be like, imagine that you want to get like different things in the grocery store.
Yep.
And before you do anything, you have the option to like either call up your friend and see if they'd be available to like drive you around, or you could like call up your friend and say, I hate you, get out of my life, right? And if you say the second one, then like your friend's not going to help you drive around. You're going to like close off some options, but otherwise you could do the same things. So if you think about these as graphs, like one is going to be, you're going to be able to like embed the I just told my friend off subgraph into like a strict subgraph of the I just called and asked my friend for help. So like by just maintaining relations with your friend, you're keeping your options open in a sense, and we show that this tends to be power seeking according to the formal measure, and it also tends to be optimal over telling your friend off in this example. And so this argument will apply for all time preferences the agent could have.
Yep.
But it is a pretty delicate graphical requirement, at least at present, because it requires a precise kind of like similarity between these subgraphs. If there's no way to like exactly embed one subgraph of the environment that like represents, that here the graph is representing the different states and the different actions the agent can take between, from one state to another. And it's just representing the structure of the world. And if you can't exactly, embed one subgraph into another, then the condition won't be met for the theorem. And it's a good bit easier to apply the second kind of symmetries we look at, which is what these kind of far-sighted, long-term reward maximizing agents will tend to be optimal for them. If they're maximizing average per time step reward, what will tend to be optimal? And here, since you're only maximizing the average reward, whatever you do in the short term doesn't matter. It just matters like, where do you end up? Like, what's the final state of the world? Or if there's like some cycle of states you alternate between, and you want to say, well, the terminal options here are, to the right are bigger than the terminal options to the left. Like I can embed the left options into the right options, the left set of like final world states into the right set of final world states. For example, in Pac-Man, if the agent is about to be eaten by a ghost, then then it would show a game over screen, and we could think of the agent as just like staying in the game over screen. Or if it avoided the ghost, there's a whole bunch of other game over screens it could induce eventually, much of them after future levels, like after the agent had progressed to future levels. But also there's different cycles through the level the agent could induce. There's lots of different terminal options the agent has by staying alive. And so since you can say, well, imagine the agent liked dying to ghosts, well then we could turn this like I like dying to ghosts objective into an I like staying alive objective by switching the rewarded assigns to the ghost terminal state with like the rewarded assigns to some like I die on level 53 terminal state. And since you can do that, there's more objectives for which it's optimal to stay alive than there are for which it's optimal to die here. So we can say, well, even without giving the agent the Pac-Man score function, it'll still tend to be optimal for the agent to like play well and stay alive and finish the level so that it can get to future levels where most of its options are.
Yeah. And that seems kind of tricky though, because like if we're just thinking about these like terminal states it can be in, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, here's a fact. I don't exactly know how Pac-Man works. It seems like there are two different ways that Pac-Man could work. The first way is that when you finish the game, there's a game over screen and all it says is game over. The second way is that there's a game over screen and it shows your score.
Right.
Right? And like it seems like in this case of these like really far-sighted agents, like what results you get about like whether they tend to like die early or not. In the cases where it shows your score at the end of like on the screen at the end, then you really have this thing where like the agents don't want to die early because there's so many possible end screens that they can end up in.
Yeah.
But if it's the same end screen no matter what you do, then it kind of seems like you're not going to get this argument about not wanting to die so that you can get this variety of end screens because there's only one end screen. I don't know. To me, this seems kind of puzzling or kind of strange. I'm wondering what thoughts you have about it.
Yeah. So I'd like to point out a third possibility, which
Yep.
I think I played Pac-Man a while back when making the example, but I forget. It could be like show like game over at the top and like show the board and like the other information.
Yeah.
In which case you would like get this argument. But if it doesn't, here's a fascinating thing. If there's only one game over screen, then as a matter of fact, average optimal policies will not necessarily tend to like have a specific preference towards staying alive, towards just like dying. Now you could move to different criteria of optimality, but like it may seem kind of weird that in the average optimal setting they wouldn't have an incentive, but due to the structure of the environment, it's just a fact. Like at first it's like, I kind of want to make this come out so like they still stay alive anyways.
Yep.
But it just actually turns out to like that's how instrumental convergence works in that setting.
Yeah, but in that case, it seems like these far-sighted agents are kind of a bad model of like what we expect to happen, right? Because I kind of don't. That's kind of not how I expect smart agents. It's not how I expect it to play out, right?
Yeah, and so in this situation, you would want to look at something like you'd want to look at like for really high discount rates for agents that don't just like care perfectly about like every state equally, but like they just care a good deal about future reward. And then in this case, you could say, well, first, can you apply theorem 6.9 and say like, well, will this course of action always be optimal? Or you could say, well, at this high discount rate, like there's a way of like representing which options the agent can take as vectors and see like, well, can I still get a similarity? And if you can still make the same argument. Like, look, there's like n long-term options that the agent has, and there's only one if it dies, right? And like you can build this similarity argument. If you can't do it exactly, my current suspicion is that like if you tweak like one of the transition dynamics, like in one of the terminal states by like 0.0001, like it seems to me like the theorems shouldn't just go out the window, but there's like some continuity property. And so like if like this almost holds, then you can probably say some like slightly weakened version of our conclusion and then still like conclude instrumental convergence in that case.
So one question this paper kind of prompts in me is that if I think about this like power maximization behavior, it seems like it leads to some bad outcomes or some outcomes that I really don't want my AI to have. But also, it seems like there's some reward function for an AI system that like really would incentivize the behavior that I actually want.
Right.
I'm imagining. So like, what's so special about like my ideal reward function for an AI system, such that even though it's this kind of behavior is optimal for most reward functions, it's not optimal for the reward function that like I really want.
So I think that like power seeking isn't intrinsically a bad thing. Like there are ways an agent could seek power responsibly, or like some benevolent dictator, reward function you give the agent. What I think you learn if you learn that the agent is seeking power, at least in the intuitive sense, is that a lot of these outcomes are now catastrophic. Like most of the ways that this could happen is probably going to be catastrophic for you because there's relatively few ways in which it would be motivated to use that power for the betterment of humanity or of Daniel or something. But if you learn that the AI is not seeking power, it might not be executing your most preferred plan, but like you're not getting screwed over, or at least not by the AI, perhaps.
Okay, so really like the actual thing I want does involve seeking power, but just in a way that would be fine for me.
Yeah, that could be true.
Okay, so you said that the relationship of this that this had some relationship to attainable utility preservation. I'm wondering beyond that, how do you think that this fits into AI alignment?
As I mentioned, I think there's some explaining to do about why we should expect, from first principles, why should we expect catastrophically bad misalignment failures. And also I see this like through that path providing insights into, like inner alignment. Like most ways so-called mesa optimizer, or like a learned optimizer that's considering different plans and then executing one that does well for its like learned objective. For most ways this could be true. For example, it would be power seeking, right? This is not just like an outer alignment. We write down a reward function phenomenon. It's talking about what is it like to have, to maximize expected utility over some like set of outcome lotteries. And so you can both generalize these arguments beyond just the RL setting, beyond the MDP setting to different kinds of environments. Also, it motivates the idea of not only why catastrophic events could happen through misalignment, but why it seems really hard to write down objective functions that don't have this property, right? Like it could be 50-50, but it's not like, it doesn't seem like 50-50. It seems like almost everything 0 or like some very vanishingly small number of like real world objectives that like when competently maximized would not lead to very bad things. And so earlier this summer, I had a result giving quantitative bounds on like for every reward or for every utility function, like the vast majority of its permuted variance, like quote unquote variance of this objective, will have these power seeking incentives. So there might be like some kind of very narrow target, and just like providing a formal motivation for that. And then lastly, one of my more ambitious goals that I have recently made a lot of headway on has been saying something about the kinds of cognition or of decision-making processes under which we should expect this to hold. The paper talks about, optimal policies, which is pretty unrealistic in real-world settings. And so there's been, I think, a concern for a while. It's like, well, will this tell us interesting things beyond optimal? And the answer to that is like basically yes. That it's not just about optimality, but in some sense it's about consequentialism and optimizing over like outcomes that will lead to these kinds of qualitative tendencies. But again, that's not like up yet, so I don't have anything to point to.
Yeah, so one thing you said is that it motivates this idea that like it might actually be quite likely that AI systems could have like really bad consequences. When you say it motivates that, so one thing it does is that it like clarifies the conditions under which it holds, and like maybe you can do some quantification of it. But also like I think a lot of people in the AI alignment community kind of already believe this anyway. I'm wondering like, have there been any cases of like people hearing this and like then kind of changing their mind about it? Well, has there been cases where like, this was the actual motivation of someone's like actual beliefs about AI alignment?
I think there might have been a handful of cases. I don't know where there's like at least a significant shift, but maybe not like 0 to 100. Yeah, I think, it's not the primary point of the paper to like persuade people in alignment. I think we're broadly in agreement. Like it actually could have turned out to be false. And like under some narrow conditions, like it is false that, agents will tend to seek power. And I did get some pushback from like some people in alignment who are like, well, I thought this is true. And like, so I'm now like suspicious of your model or something. But I think it's just like, and like there's, naturally even very good philosophical arguments will often gloss over some things. And so like understanding, I think less like persuading or like convincing the alignment community of a new phenomenon here, and more setting up a chain of formal arguments. It's like, look, what exactly is the source of risk? Like if we agree that it's so bad that you optimize expected utility, well, why should that be true on a formal level? And if so, like where can we best interrupt the arguments and for this holding, right? And what things could avoid this?
Okay.
We can obviously think about it without, formalizing a million things. But like I think this is a much better frame for something you want to be highly confident about, or a much better like procedure.
Yeah. What do you think the best like if you think about the chain of arguments that in your paper lead to power seeking, what do you think the best like premise or step to intervene on is?
Well, so in the paper, like I don't think the paper presents like an end-to-end, or like I don't think the paper by itself should be a significant update for real-world AI risk, because it's talking about optimal policies, talking about full observability. There's like these other complications. But if like I take the sum of the work so far I've done on this, then it seems to me that there's something going on with consequentialism over outcomes, over observations, over state histories that just tends to produce these tendencies. But if you zoom out to the agent grading like its actions and not its actions as consequences of things necessarily, then like there's no instrumental convergence in that setting, at least not without further assumptions. So I think there's something like, for example, you have like approval based agents that are like you're like argmaxing some trained model of humans' approval function for different actions. I think I like that approach. I mean, I don't fully endorse it. It's like the end, obviously, but I there's something I really like about that approach. And B, I think part of why I like it, or one thing I noticed about it, is like it doesn't have like these incentives. Like since you're doing action prediction and not like reasoning, you're not like reasoning about the whole trajectory and such.
Yeah. Why does it though? Because like if you think about human approval of so first I should say approval based agents. I believe you can Google that, and Paul Christiano has written some about it. We went sort of what it maybe sounds like. One thing about that idea is that like it seems like it could be the case that like whether human approval of an action is like linked to does it achieve some goals that like the human endorses or whatever, and that actually like predicting like human approval is just like you're predicting some Q function, some measure of like how much it achieves, like it leads to the achievement of like goals that the human has. So I'm wondering, like, do you think that like to what extent are these like actually different as opposed to just like this action approval thing maybe just being like normal optimization of like utility functions over world states kind of in disguise?
Yeah, so I think it's not another part of the arguments where you can interrupt it that I haven't talked about yet is if power seeking is not cognitively accessible to the agent. It's like considering like it knows how to make a subset of outcomes happen, but like those aren't particular. It doesn't really know how to make many power seeking things happen. Then of course it's not going to seek power. And so like if you have your agent either not want to or not be able to conceive of power seeking plans, right? Then you're going to tend to be fine. At least from that perspective of like, will it go to one of these outcomes, like the big power seeking ones or not?
Okay.
And humans don't know how to do that, right?
Seems like many people do in fact seek power.
Like, yeah, people like want to seek power, but like an individual person might like you might predict that they would approve of like the AI gaining some power in this situation, and so like maybe the AI ends up accruing like some like somewhat lopsided amount of power compared to like if the human had just done it, because they're kind of amplifying the human by argmaxing and like doing more than the human could have considered. But I think it's also the case that like because of the human's inability to first recognize certain power seeking plans as good, but also because of the human's like actual alignment with humans' values, like there's a combination of factors that are going to push against these plans tending to be considered. I also think there's something like it is possible to just take an action-based frame on like utility maximization and just like convert between the two. Like the way you do it is important. So like I think there's one thing I showed is a recent blog post on the alignment forum that instrumental convergence in some broad class of environments, if you zoom out to the agent grading action observation histories, like its utility function is over the whole action observation history. It does this, it sees that, does this, sees that for like a million time steps. And then in the deterministic case, at least, there's no instrumental convergence. Like there's just as many agents that'll want to choose action A, like going left compared to going right in every situation. Like
it's almost like the no free lunch theorem there, right? Like in general, if like all possible utilities over action observation histories are equally possible, then like no action can any action is compatible with like a whole half of the space.
Yeah, this is why certain like coherence arguments about these histories, it doesn't really tell us much because any history is compatible with any goal, or sorry, not any history is compatible with any goal, but like you can rationalize any behavior as coherent with respect to some ridiculously expressive objective over the whole action observation history. But with these histories, like sure, there's like these relatively low dimensional subsets of it where it's like you're only grading the observations, right? And then in that subset, you're going to get really strong instrumental convergence. So like it really matters how you take your subsets. And so or like what the language in which, or the interface through which you specify the objective. And so like I don't think I've given a full case for why like approval directed agency should like not at optimum at least go and like fall into these pitfalls perhaps. But like I think that some of these considerations bear in it.
Okay. So one other thing that I wanted to talk about is part of the motivation, right? Is like you're worried that like somehow like the amount of power that the agent has, that this agent that you build has, is going to maybe trade off against like the amount of power that you have, right?
Yeah.
But like power of like if you think about it, it's not always a zero sum thing, right? For instance, like maybe I invent like the computer and like I make more and sell them to you, and now like I have the ability to do like a greater variety of stuff, and so do you because we have this like new tool available to us.
Yeah.
Like I'm wondering how you think about the kind of multiplayer game where there's a human and an AI, and like how we should think of power in that setting, and like what's going to be true about it.
Right. This is a good question. I've supervised some preliminary work on this question through the Stanford Existential Risk Initiative, and I was working with Jacob Stavrianos, and we got some preliminary results for this so-called normal form constant sum case where, everyone's utility has to add up to some constant. So if I gain some, then you're necessarily losing some. And what we showed was under a reasonable extension of this formalization of power to the multi-agent, multiplayer setting, was that if the players are Nash, then their values basically have to add up to the constant, which is pretty well known. But if they're not, then that means that there's extra power to go around, kind of. Like, imagine we're playing chess and we both suck.
Yep.
And so we both have the power to just win the game with probability 1 by just playing optimally. But, so, like, we both...
Kind of given the other player's policy, right?
Yeah, given the other player's policy. So we both have the power to win the game.
Yep.
But if we're already in Nash, then we're both already playing as well as possible. And so there's no extra power to go around. So as the players get like smarter or improve their strategies, the sum power is going to decrease. And so we had, the power is greater than or equal to the constant with equality if and only if they're in Nash.
Yeah, that's kind of it's kind of a weird result, right?
How so?
Everyone's really powerful as long as everyone's really bad at stuff.
Yeah.
Like maybe because it's related to the zero sum setting. But like, why do some people like intuitively, or why do some people not worry about AI? Right? I think like a big motivation is like, look, you create smart agents in the environment. That's kind of like creating other humans. Like, the world isn't zero sum. Like people can like do well for themselves by inventing useful things that like help everyone else, and like maybe AI will kind of be like that. I mean, that's not the full details of an argument, but it seems like it's really closely related to this non-zero sum nature of the world, right? And similarly, like if I imagine like cases where like the AI can increase its power and also my power, it seems like closely related. Not to like, we can both increase our power because like we both had a lot of power because we were both sucking, but like more like we're now. I guess it's almost like we're gaining more ways to like manipulate the environment and like win at the PvE, the player versus environment, to use gaming terminology. Yeah. As far as I know, I don't actually game. Instead of like playing a PvP game. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Formally I still don't understand it, the non-zero sum case as well. So like I don't have a formal answer to that, but I would expect the world to be more like, look, it's already really well optimized, like power, because it's instrumental conversion. It's something that people compete over, and like I'd imagine like it's like reasonably efficient. Like I'd be surprised if they're like just an easy way to rule the world. Not like easy in an absolute sense, but like easy to a human, right? Yeah. Like there's not gonna be like a weird trick where I can like become president in a week or something, because if there were, like, people care about that already. Yeah. Whereas like if there were like a weird trick for me to improve my alignment research output, then like it's still probably not super plausible, but it's way more plausible than like, because like not that many people care about gaining alignment research outputs as much. Yeah. Right. So
they don't want to like steal your ability to do alignment research.
So yeah, I would expect like the AI is trying to gain power. It's in a system like it's in like a reasonably competitive, non-zero sum, but still reasonably competitive system. And so like I think a lot of the straightforward ways of gaining power are going to look like taking power from people. And also, if your goal is like spatially regular over the universe, then even though it could share with you, it's still going to be better for it to eventually not share with you. It might share with you instrumentally, but like there's an earlier paper by Nate Soares that...
And I think Sphere Benson-Tilson as well.
Yes,
if
yes.
that's the one
Yep.
we're thinking of.
Formalizing convergent instrumental subgoals, I believe. And it approaches from the perspective of an agent that has a utility function that is additive over parts of the universe, and it's maximizing this utility function, and so, it's got different resources. It can move around between different sectors, right? And so even if it doesn't care about what's going on in a sector, it's still going to care about using the resources from the sector for, other parts of its goal, right? And I think, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to have like an expected utility maximizer with a spatially regular goal over the whole universe state or something. But I think that kind of argument will probably apply.
Yeah, it's, to me, intuitively, it seems like probably what's going to happen, or probably the way the analysis would go is like, you sort of have like maybe a non-zero sum phase or like non-zero sum phases and zero sum phases, right? Where like, you like increase your power by like inventing cool technology and vaccines and like, doing generally useful stuff. And then like once you're on the proto frontier, well, like maybe you hit a proto frontier of like how much power you can have and how much power I can have. And then you like fight over where on the frontier you end up on. But I don't know. I guess I'd be kind of interested to see, real formal results on that.
I would too. One more way this could happen is if you have a bunch of transformative AIs and they're all, let's say that they're like reasoning about the world, and we could say even if individually they would take a plan that Pareto improves everyone's power, or just makes everyone better off in terms of how much control they have. They might have uncertainty about what the other agents will do, and so they might get into some nasty dynamics where they're saying, well, like I basically don't trust these other agents, so even though I might prefer, all else equal, taking this everybody wins plan, I don't know what the other agents are going to do. So I'd prefer they might be unaligned or whatever. So I'd prefer like gaining power destructively to letting this other agent win, and so then they all gain power destructively. I think that's another basic model where this could happen. So
wrapping up a bit, if I think about this sort of broad research vision that sort of encompasses both AEP and this like power-seeking paper, what follow-up work are you kind of most interested in? Like, what extensions seem most valuable to you?
That are extensions of both works?
Or just like, sense? Just sort of future work in the same vein.
So understanding more realistic goal specification procedures, like what if it's featureized, right? Like the symmetry arguments, if you permute a featureized goal, or if you, modify it somewhat, then the modification might not be expressible as another featureized objective. And so like the arguments might not go through.
Although it seems like it's possible that in the featureized case, you get, like, maybe the environment it's more realistic to expect the environment to have built-in symmetries of, like, flipping, feature 1 doesn't change, like, the available things for feature 3, then I don't know if that actually pans out. But
yeah, I think often that'll pan out, but, like, it could be the case that in some like, weird worlds, it could be true.
Yeah.
And so I basically haven't thought about that. There's, like, a bunch of things that I've been thinking about, and that has not really moved up to the top. I also would be excited to see AEP applied to embodied tasks, or like tasks where, you've got at least, maybe not embodied, but at least like simulated, where you have an agent moving around in some 3D environment, and you're able to learn like value estimates pretty well. Like if the agent can learn value estimates well, then it should be able to do AEP well. Also, I want to have results on when the agent is uncertain about its environment, or it's managing some kind of uncertainty. It seems like, at least at one point in time, Vanessa Kosoi mentioned that a large part of how they think about power seeking is as robustness against uncertainty. If you're either not sure what your goal should be, this is like kind of power as we formalized it, or if you're not sure like how things could fail, then if you have a lot of power, you have a lot of slack, a lot of resources, I'm not going to die if I wake up like too sick to work tomorrow, for example. I have some measure of power, even though, like I'd want to be robust against that uncertainty. If that weren't the case, I'd take actions right now. And so another source of power seeking could be uncertainty, either about objective, in which case it'd be normative uncertainty, or uncertainty about the environment that it's in, or some other kind. And so I think there's probably good results to be had there.
Yeah.
In particular, one easily a legible formal problem is extending the MDP results, the Markov decision results, to partially observable Markov decision processes, where the agent doesn't see the whole world all at once. We already have results for these more general environments, which don't have to be fully observable, but I still want to understand more about how the structure of the world and the structure we assume over the agent's objective will affect the strength and kinds of instrumental convergence we observe. Then on the AUP front, I'd be excited to see AUP applied to at least a simulated 3D environment, perhaps partially observable. Basically in an environment where current reinforcement learning techniques can already learn good value function networks, then I would expect AUP should be able to do decently well here. And if not, that'd be important to learn for more, I guess, practical applications.
So the point here is just like extending AUP to like closer to the kind of cutting edge of reinforcement learning. Is that right?
And if it works, I think it'd be, a good demo. Like, it'd be like viscerally impressive in a sense that, large 2D worlds are not.
Yeah. I also wonder, so one thing that strikes me, it seems like some of the classic cases of power seeking or whatever are in cases where the agent has like bounded cognition and wants to expand those bounds. So like there's this famous, I don't know if it was Marvin Minsky, but there's some discussion of like, look, if your goal is to like calculate as many digits of pi as possible, you need like a ton of computers. And like, of course, the optimal policy is to just write down all the correct digits, right? But like somehow like optimality is kind of hiding the like, in this case, it's hiding the key role of like instrumental convergence or of like resource gathering. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this kind of bounded optimality case.
So I don't think this is all bounded optimality. Or I don't think perfect optimality is itself to blame here. So as I alluded to earlier, there's going to be some results that show under a wide range of decision-making procedures, Boltzmann rational, satisficing, and so on. You're still going to get tendencies of, similar strength. Like, so you're moving away from optimality. You're letting the agent consider like relatively small sets of plans. You still might observe it. I think there's something with the agent, our formalism's not dealing with the agent thinking about its own thinking about if I got more computers, I'd have more abilities and such. At least with that particular example. Separately, I do think that optimal power as, the agent's average optimal value does hide more realistic nuances of what we think of as power, right? Where, I think it's wrong to say you have the power to win the lottery. All you have to do is just like go get a ticket with the right number, right? There's a policy that does it. And so, optimality is a problem in that sense as well. And I do have some formalisms or relaxations of power that I think deal with it better. But with respect to the compute example, I think that's partially an embedded agency issue.
Okay. So, zooming out a little bit more, I'm wondering like how, suppose somebody like really wants to understand what like the Alex Turner agenda is, or like what does like Alex Turner research taste look like? How do you like get research done? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what does it look like for you to do alignment research?
Before I do that, I will know I've written several posts on the alignment forum about this. Okay. And they'll be in the text version or the transcript. What is Alex Turner?
Description of this episode.
In the description. What does Alex Turner research look like? One of my defining characteristics is I think I really like small examples. This isn't unique to me, but especially compared to people outside the alignment community, some of my colleagues at Oregon State, like I think I have more of an instinct of notice philosophical confusion about a concept, or notice, this seems like an important argument that is not sufficiently, detailed, or like this is kind of unfortunate that this argument holds, like for AI risk, like what are the, like, how could we get around it? Like how can how can I drive a car through this argument? Basically, like how can I like avoid one of the conditions? And so there's some amount of acquired research taste I have at this point that tells me what I'd like to double click on or to zoom in on. But once I'm doing that, I'm like trying to find the minimal working example of my confusion. The most trivial example where I'm still confused about some aspect of the thing. It might be like, well, what's power? Or like, well, like, what does it mean? What does instrumental convergence mean? There's a point in time where, I was walking around and I thought, maybe there's no like deep explanation. It's like some like there's like a bunch of factors that play into it, lots of empirical facts, and like maybe there's no clean explanation. But this didn't really feel right to me, and so like I kept looking, and I kept like writing down lots of small examples, and I'd like get one piece of the puzzle and like I'd have a checklist of, well, now that I understand, hey, the discount rate or the agent's time preferences is going to really matter here. And like the agent's, its optimal policies will change with the discount rate. Its incentives will change with the discount rate. Like, what more can I say? And then I'll go, like, I'll have a list of like problems I've been thinking about, and I'll see if I can tackle any of those now. And sometimes I can't, and I'll go back and forth between, I'll like hop back over maybe to AUP, to more of my conventional thesis work that I'm doing for my thesis, and I'll start thinking about that. And then there's a period of about a year where every 3 months or so I try and come back and generalize the results so that they talk about, like not just some very neutral specific cases, but like some more general cases. And I couldn't get leeway, and so like it came back like 3 times, or headway, and like it came back 3 times, and finally I was able to like have the insight in the proper form. And so like it's a like somewhat acquired taste on what's promising to zoom in on, what's going to actually matter. B, working with small examples, and C, like keeping a list of things that I'll like keep trying to attack and see if I can get, make headway on those. I'd say that those are 3 salient aspects of how I do research. I think one trait I have that has served me very well is like just an assumption that not everything has been thought through and found, and especially given like the relatively low size or small size of the alignment community. There's a lot of smart people, but there's not a lot of people. And so I'll just kind of like, in some sense, naively look out at the world and just like see what comes to mind to me. And like, I'll just like attack the problem. And it won't necessarily be a question of, well, I should thoroughly examine the literature and make sure there's a hole. And like, maybe someone like actually came up with some, really good formalization of power or instrumental convergence somewhere. And it's like, it doesn't even enter my mind. And first I'm just like, not at all reluctant to think from like first principles, and to kind of just not have any expectation that I will be repeating thoughts that other people have had, because usually that hasn't been the case. And I think that probably won't be the case in alignment for, at least several more years.
Okay. You've sort of answered this question already, but just to sort of bring in one place, like, what do you see as like the Alex Turner agenda? Like, what are you broadly like trying to do in your research, and like what do you want out of your future research, kind of?
So right now and into the near future, I want to be able to lay out a detailed story for how expected utility maximization is just a bad idea for like on an AGI scale. Not because this is, something I need to persuade the community of, but to, A, understand ways we can make the argument fail for other approaches. And B, there's some persuasion value, I think, to writing papers that get into, more normal conferences. And C, there's I think there's been a significant amount of deconfusion for me along the way that's tied in past arguments about like coherence, and past arguments about like when should we expect power seeking to occur, and like some, there's like some modifications to that. Like, I think there's a range of benefits, but mostly the main benefit is something like, if you are really confident that something is going to fail horribly and you want to build something that doesn't fail horribly, then it would be a good idea to understand exactly why it would tend to fail horribly.
Okay.
And I don't think I've established the full argument for it actually failing horribly, but I think the work has contributed to that.
Okay. So if I think about that agenda, what other like types of research do you think like combine, like what other agendas would combine nicely with your agenda to like, you do your thing, this other agenda happens, and then bam, things are amazing forever? Does anything come to mind?
Amazing forever. High bar.
Maybe just like quite good for a while.
At some point, I'm going to, this agenda has to confront, what abstractions do you make goals with, or do you specify goals with? What are the featurizations like? How should we expect agents to think? Like, what are their ontologies? What are their learned world models? Like, how are they going to abstract different things and, take statistics of the environment in some sense? So I think John Wentworth's agenda will probably collide with this one at some point.
Okay.
I think this also can maybe help make arguments about like the alignment properties of different training procedures. So like, if you could argue that you're going to be producing models that somewhat resemble like draws from program space according to some like prior, and then if you can say something about what that prior looks like using these theorems, and then so like that can help bridge, okay, this training process is approximating this like more well understood like program sampling process, and then you apply like theorems to say, well, but actually this process is going to have, you know, maybe these kinds of malign reasoners in it with like at least this probability. And so like I think that this can help with arguments like that as well, but that's like less of a clear research agenda and more of just like an intersection.
Okay, so the penultimate question, well, the possibly penultimate question I have is what questions should I have asked that I didn't actually get to?
There's a question of like, well, what's like a Steelman of the case against power seeking, or against like basically how could Jan LeCun and others basically like broadly end up being right or something.
Okay.
In arguing things like, well, they're not going to have evolutionary pressure under some designs to stay alive and such, and so therefore like these incentives won't arise or need not arise if we don't, you know, kind of hard code them in.
Okay.
And maybe like I don't think this argument is correct, but you could say something like maybe we end up getting pretty general RL agents through like some kind of, you know, multi-agent task where they need to learn to complete a range of tasks, and they're like competing and cooperating with each other, and like maybe they learn some kind of really strong cooperation drive, and also maybe their goals don't actually generalize. They're not like spatially regular across the universe or anything. They're like fairly narrow and kind of like more reflex agenty, but in a very sophisticated way. Like they're like reflex agenty, or they're like responding to the world and optimizing kind of like a control system, but not necessarily like trying to, you know, like a thermostat doesn't, you know, like optimize the world to most be at the, you know, given like control point. And so like maybe that's one story of how objective generalization ends up panning out, where, you know, they basically learn cooperation instincts as an instrumental goal or as a goal, and then things end up working fine. But I don't find it super convincing, but I think it's better.
Okay. So the final question: if people listen to this and they're like really interested in you and your work, how could they learn more or follow you?
So first, I maintain a blog on the AI alignment forum. My username is my name, Alex Turner, and there'll be a link in the description. And also my Google Scholar, Alexander Matt Turner. You can stay abreast of, you know, whatever new papers I'm putting up there. And if you want to reach out, my my alignment forum account, the bio has my email as well.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
This episode is edited by Finn and Adamson, and Justice Mills helped with transcription. The financial costs of making this episode are covered by a grant from the Long-Term Future Fund. To read a transcript of this episode, or to learn how to support the podcast, you can visit axrp.net. That's axrp.net. Finally, if you have any feedback about this podcast, you can email me at feedback@axrp.net.